if you go to the jungles of Colombia where they're making cocaine in jungle labs, most of the people working in those jungle labs are working there at the point of a gun.
Correct.
They don't have autonomy, and many of the people selling sex don't have the autonomy to make a choice to go and do something different. They're stuck in there until they're either too old to work or they clamber out the window and run away. When you sit and talk with someone who works at that end of criminality, for them this is simply business. And they want business to go as smoothly and calmly as is possible. And it's a real rarity if you are sitting in conversation with someone who is utterly unpredictable. And those are uncomfortable circumstances. And I used the best word I could think of at the time to describe those. So you need to go and be prepared, but ultimately, these people are in it for business. This is just about money.
Hello and welcome to the Intelligence Advantage podcast, where we talk to the movers and shapers in the investigation and intelligence space. My name is Gary Miller. I've been an investigative lawyer for nearly half a century, and I'm also the chairman of the IFG, a network of international investigative and asset recovery lawyers. I'm delighted to be joined by a good friend of mine, Neil Giles. Neil and I have worked together at the Traffic Analysis Hub, where he is president and CEO. But Neil is one of the few people I have met that has been in the investigation space longer than me. Neil has been in that space for over half a century. I know it doesn't look that way, Neil, but you were, or you have been. And I'm delighted to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to join you.
Before I ask you a few questions about the young Neil who joined the Metropolitan Police at the tender age of 17, you tell me, I'm going to ask you kind of one of those questions that I always wonder about when people have been involved, as you were in SOCA, in Metropolitan Police, etc. Was there a time that you recall that you ever felt in personal danger as a result of the investigations you did?
Yes, on more than one occasion.
And can you pick one and give us a flavor of what that both looked like and what it felt like for you?
I spent a number of years as an organised crime undercover infiltrator. So in the mid 1980s, I would be introduced to through an informant to groups of people who were keen to sell large quantities of narcotics. And on one particular occasion, and this matter's been through the courts very openly, so there's nothing secret here. But on one particular occasion, I was foolish enough to make the meeting for the exchange of money and drugs, as the bad guys thought, who were two Colombian gentlemen, in the car park of the Serpentine restaurant in Hyde Park.
What a great location, Neil. Here's me thinking some dingy garage in Wapping, but not my friend Neil. He goes for the real up-class establishments.
It was designed principally for mutual security. It's really hard to hide a lot of cops in the car park of the Serpentine restaurant in Hyde Park.
I've got this vision, Neil. I've got this vision of undercover police either dressed up as trees or alternatively operating as waiters in the restaurant.
Yeah, there are smarter ways to do it than that, but we're not far wrong. It was carefully planned.
Right.
There was concern that the bad guys might be armed, so we had authorized firearms officers available, and the idea was that at the appropriate time, once we were convinced that we'd actually seen the narcotics and we had the evidence that we needed, that we give the signal for those officers that were secreted um, to come and arrest the bad guys, and just in order to create a short-term gap in their understanding as to what had gone on, so that the people that had assisted us along the way could be as safe as possible. I was supposed to skip the scene. Um, and I was relatively young and fit in those days. So at the appropriate moment, I gave the signal, and my colleagues exited their hiding places as planned. And I trotted off, a bit quicker than trotted, um, only to discover after about 100 meters that actually pretty much all the cops were chasing me. and and some of them were armed. Um,
Oh
and
my
and
God.
of course, nothing untoward occurred. The bad guys were appropriately apprehended by those that managed to retain their sense of equilibrium. Um, and the matter proceeded through the justice process as per normal. But I have to say, being chased by policemen with guns was scary.
And so I must admit, I didn't expect the story to develop in that way, but it's a great story. And it's a great example how, but for the best laid plans, right? You can do everything. And then something just gets thrown into the into the mix. So what was it in your case that made these cops, had they not been briefed as to the guy in the red trousers was not to be shot at or arrested?
Now, there was my first mistake, Gary. I weren't wearing red trousers. Um, and of course, and I alluded to it in kind of my setup
Right.
for the story, in that it was a very dark environment,
Ah,
very poorly street lit. I'd made it for after dark. There were a lot of parked cars. There was kind of more movement in the car park than was helpful. You'd like it to be a bit quieter, but it wasn't that quiet. And you've got to bear in mind, of course, that the general public need to be as far removed from situations that might go pear-shaped as is possible. And I'm going back 40 years
yeah,
here.
yeah.
So, and it was a different world. But 2 kilos of cocaine and appropriate arrests were made, and convictions subsequently emerged.
Wow. And your undercover career, when I asked you, had you ever felt in danger? I mean, I might be wrong, but every single time that you went into a scenario as Bill Smith, whatever your legend was, you were in danger, Neil. You were in real danger of being somebody having grasped you or having suspected you and being taken away and disposed of in a body bag, weren't you?
That's a bit dramatic to,
Ah,
I'd like to think we planned better than that.
okay.
We didn't routinely go out on a whim. We would make sure that we had contingency plans in place for things that went wrong. I can think of other instances where um, where situations got really complicated. But I always had the confidence that there was a backstop in place if it really went badly pear-shaped. Um, yes, been scared many times. Bad guys get scared when they're in the middle of a trade. They're working on really high adrenaline.
Right.
Um, the best of them retain a really calm and businesslike air, and that was always my approach. Um, if I'm talking to someone who, um, in fact, it was the lesson for all of my investigative career. When you sit and talk with someone who works at that end of criminality, for them this is simply business, and
Right.
they want business to go as smoothly and calmly as is possible. And um, and it's a real rarity if you are sitting in conversation with someone who is utterly unpredictable. And those are uncomfortable circumstances. And I've used the best word I could think of at the time to describe those.
No, I get it.
But yes, so you need to go and be prepared. But ultimately, these people are in it for business. This is just about money.
And can I ask you, sorry to interrupt you, when you were, for how long were you undercover, if you're allowed to say? If not, I'll move on.
It was a dip in and out kind
Okay.
of life. So in the early days, it was very unregulated. Subsequently, it became much more scientific. And indeed, later in my career, after I got promoted a couple of times, I became the national trainer for
For undercover people.
for undercover officers, and led the group at Scotland Yard that led and delivered that work. And bringing my own experience to that environment, I think was helpful, because it helped me um, to cover off some of the areas that I'd traditionally been uncomfortable with, to make sure that we recruited into the work and trained people who could cope with the work, because living a different identity for a length of time can be distorting for an individual. So to be able to return to normality in some way, shape, or form quite quickly after your deployment is really quite important. The longer you're out in a fake identity, living a different personality, a different entity, the more complicated things get. So
Of
long-term
course.
infiltrations are problematic.
And what impact, you're here, you look reasonably normal. I've known you for a few years. What kind of impact would had it what impact did it have on you to mentally and psychologically once you'd been in and come out of a situation? Do you now look back and feel, gosh, that had a really powerful impact on me and the way I saw the world, or just I wanted to lock myself away? Or were you one of those individuals that are pretty stoic and you just worked through it all and it was another day in the office for you?
Probably all of the above, to be fair.
Right.
I didn't, with the adrenaline at the end of an operation. It wasn't the sort of thing I could go off and celebrate a success in relation to. I just needed to go away and de-stress, I suppose. So after I completed the administrative material that needed doing, my answer was to just go home if I could. So I would disappear and go home. It did have an adverse impact on my relationship, without shadow of a doubt, and I did divorce during that period. And can I lay the blame at the door of my work as an undercover officer? Probably in part. But yeah, all of these experiences help shape your understanding of the world that you're there to police, investigate. Um, and I was fortunate to be able to carry that experience into relatively senior roles in law enforcement, because the more you understand about how criminal business works, the greater the opportunity you've got uh, to be more effective as a law enforcement entity. So
So please, yeah. So please stop me if I'm being a bit too probing. But for example, was your ex-wife, was she in the force with you, or did you marry a civilian, as they say?
I did. I married a civilian, quite young, married at 20, 21.
And do you think that, again, all I can do, well, I do have a few friends like you who have been through and come out the other end and gone into the private sector. But you get the feeling generally, and of course from TV, etc., that it's not like of course, the private sector where you're paid overtime or you work harder and you get more shares, and I know you work hard, you get promotion, but it just seems to me that there is a huge tension between being a police officer, particularly in an area of narcotics, undercover, serious organized crime. There is a tension that makes it almost impossible to keep a stable relationship at the same time.
I do think it's difficult, and I do think that that the service needs to do as much as it can to regularize those situations, and they have taken steps to do that. It's a much more when I did it, it was something that I had to obtain release from my normal duties to go away and do. I would always have support from other senior people within the service to do that, to negotiate with my seniors. But it was always a challenge, and your work didn't go away. Your routine work didn't go away. So yeah, it wasn't as well organized then as it is now. And I'd like to say I should take some credit for the better organisation that emerged after I took my experience into leadership in the area for a while.
So, with the benefit now, and I know you've been out of the public sector for a while, if I was a youngish recruit thinking of going into undercover work as a way of either advancing my career or because I felt passionate about somebody needing to take that extra risk, would you say, you know what, why don't you hang off getting married or anything until after you've gone through this thing? Or would your advice be, you can make it work. The structure and the relationships are such that it can be a normal-ish relationship?
I would say it's something you need to have a conversation with your partner.
Other half.
Yeah. And equally, the entry program now is much more scientific. A lot more psychology involved in it. Where the organisation tries to select people who can cope with the stresses and strains, using the learning from old soldiers like me to kind of build the profiles that are strong enough to manage it psychologically.
Now, I'm sure I'm going to come back to another risky situation where you were at risk from people other than your own colleagues or comrades. But let's go back to you at age 17. What on earth possessed you to join the Met? Did you see something on TV? Did you see Sweeney Todd or something and think, I want to be like him, or what?
No, none of the above. I was very keen to join the Navy, and I had parents who were very keen that I didn't join the Navy. And I'm a London boy, born and bred in North London.
Right.
Went to school in Edmonton. Hoping not to put your viewers off, but I'm a lover of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, and I used to walk there on a Saturday with my school friends and pay 2 shillings to get in.
Those were the days, yes.
Yeah, those were the days. And watch Jimmy Greaves and people like that play football. So my father said, "Son, you need to think about the police because they have a very good pension." I didn't think about the police because I had a good pension, but I was a relatively well-behaved young man, and if my parents wanted me to do something, I generally tried it. So I applied as a 16-year-old actually to join the cadets, and they turned me down because I was too short.
Wow.
And reapplied a year later where despite the fact I was still a teeny bit too short, they were kind enough to admit me.
So you just fluffed your hair up a bit, did you, in order to get that extra inch or what?
No, no, it wasn't that simple. The medical was one of those very old-fashioned ones. I won't go into any more details of that, Gary, but
No,
it
no,
was
please don't. So without wishing to cause you any mental stress, why at 16, I'm sure like most people, you had the you had the possibility of going on to do A levels or university. What was it? Were you like me, just not a great student, or what? What was it that made you decide not to go that route?
as the child of a working class family with five siblings,
Wow.
the university was not an option.
Okay.
Um, where people from my background didn't go to university very much.
Got it.
Then I was okay as a scholar, but not stunning. And So middle of the road. So
So what O levels
could
did you do, Neil? Do you remember?
yeah, English. I had to do. It was one of the first years they did CSEs, and I had to do CSE mathematics.
Okay.
But English, geography, history, I got O levels in those subjects. Biology, chemistry, not great grades, but yeah.
Okay.
Um,
And at school, were there, I mean, I remember I was a few years um, after you, I think, not that many, but the school's careers officer was really just somebody that said, what do you think you'd like to be, an astronaut or a doctor or a banker? And then pat you on the shoulders and say, well, that's a long way away. Why don't you do some A levels or do this or do that? But were most of your contemporaries also leaving school at that age in from where you were coming from, Neil?
yeah, 80% of the kids left at age 16. Um, some went into jobs in banking and working in local branches or
Right.
local governments, the civil service, etc. Um, very few stayed on to do full A levels, and indeed, subsequently, I bumped into two or three lads that joined the police service in later life in the Met. So two or three of my contemporaries ended up in the force as well.
I see. And what do you do at that age? Does your dad take you by the hand and you walk into the local constabulary in Edmonton, or do you go on? No, of course, it go online. There was no such thing as online. So, what do you do right away to the police force and say, "I'd like to join," or what?
Oh yes, there was a written application process, then a full morning of written exams at
Okay.
Paddington Police Station in those days.
In where? Neasden.
Paddington,
Oh,
that's where the
Paddington.
recruitment centre was. And after each written exam, someone would collect them and take them away and mark them, and then X number would be weeded out and said goodbye to. So there was a winnowing, and those that remained then had some lunch and went for medicals and an interview process.
And was it all done in one day? In other words, by the end of the day, you knew you were going to be joining or not joining.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay. So you come home from that first day, and you you tell mum and dad, "I'm in." Um, and your first assignment was what?
So you transfer in those days to it's like going to a college or a university. So I shipped off to Hendon in early September of 1971,
Oh, to
where
the training college, which no
yeah,
longer exists. Am I right?
no, I think the college is still there, but the
Ah,
cadet school that was attached there to is no longer.
okay.
Yeah, so off to the police college where there were about 300 police cadets at various stages. And I spent a very happy year at Hendon, and then went off as an 18-year-old to what they called third phase. So you'd spend time as a police cadet accompanying a police officer around the streets of London somewhere. I spent my time at Marylebone Lane Police Station, just north of Oxford Street in central London. Um,
That sounds like
and
quite a nice posting to me. If I'm thinking of Marylebone Lane now, Neil, it's quite posh.
um, uh, yes, in those days it was a very old Victorian police station with a canteen in the basement where you could share your breakfast with rodents if you were lucky.
It's, well, at least they didn't talk a lot, right?
Yeah, I absolutely. And it was an education for me to see life in a police station, particularly the throughput of the custody, what is now called custody suite, but was a charge room in those days.
Right. And having done your year, did you at any stage stop and think, my God, I had no idea that policing was actually like this?
I can't say that I did. I mean, every day, every day was a learning day,
Right.
um, and I enjoyed it enormously. So I kind of fell on my feet, if I'm truthful.
And did you have
Um,
a mentor in the person you were shadowing, either him, her, or when did you find, or indeed did you find somebody that became your mentor through either your career or part of your career?
at various stages, yes. Different people at various times. So, on when I was working on the Met's Narcotics squad in the early 1980s, along came a guy called John Grieve, who was the chief inspector. I was a scabby DS on the on a team, um, but but John Grieve was a remarkable visionary as a senior manager within the police service, and one that you want the like of which you don't find very often.
Right.
And I learned a lot from the way he thought about organized crime and particularly narcotics trafficking.
Okay. Let me just ask you this, knowing of course that things have moved on, but an inspector's exam would be focused on, would it be multiple choice? Would it be a face-to-face interview? Would it be, what would you do in this situation, Neil, if somebody pulled a gun on you? What was it like in those days?
It was law and practice. It was all written, an entire written exam. So um, you had a weight of study material
Right,
and and classes for months beforehand, and everything rested upon the score that you achieved on exam day. Um, so several hundred of you would turn up at the training school on a Saturday and sit the exam. It would take all morning, and a range of questioning styles, including quite long written answers, kind of theory questions,
right.
um, and and then thereafter you simply went into a queue to be promoted when a vacancy arose.
Interesting. And when was it that you found yourself either leaning towards or being drawn towards narcotics as an area of, I don't know whether you would call it specialty, but I think you spent quite a bit of time dealing with narcotics.
Yeah, it was my kind of it was the thing I was best at, I think, to begin with. Um, I mean, my first arrest, my first arrest as a police constable for drugs, um, literally a stop in the street, found someone with some amphetamine sulfate in a personal use, but in those days it was in the 70s that was arrestable. So I
Right.
took the gentleman to the police station and put him through the process. Um, and a detective came downstairs and said to me, "That's a really, really good job. Well done, young man. But don't do it again." It was to discourage officers from arresting people for drugs, so that there wasn't a drugs problem. The division, 1970s thinking. Um, but bless him, that individual became my first informant, um, and he told me the source of that amphetamine sulfate. So I contacted the Met's drug squad, and they routinely arrived about 4 or 5 days later having conducted some observations and with a search warrant
So hold
early in
on,
the morning.
I've got lost here. Your first arrest, you bring him back to the station, and
He
he then
gets showed.
becomes your informant and gets released back on the street.
Well, he's bailed pending.
He's bailed. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, pending appearance at court.
And did you have to do? Was it you who had the conversation about, look, Jimmy boy, we can, classic, we can go lightly on you, Gov, if you are prepared to play ball with us? Or is it like you're just bailed and you follow him and it's one of those things?
There's a slightly more formal process than that.
Okay.
If someone gives information, that the fact that they did can be brought to the attention of the court that adjudicates their case in due time.
I see.
In a process.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we followed that line, and that, bless him, that young man uh, later died of a heroin overdose, unfortunately, because he
Oh,
was a
wow.
heroin addict already. But yeah, he was able to let us know about the address that he'd been buying amphetamine sulfate from as a substitute for heroin, and that proved to be good information. And when it was searched, a reasonable quantity of amphetamine sulfate, and 3 people were arrested by the Met Central Drug Squad. That was the first time I'd ever seen the big boys at work, I suppose. And that was my encouragement to think I'd really like to work there one day.
And so what I'm interested in as well is the psychology of how people behave when they are when they've committed a criminal offense, and how you watch a lot of movies with customs officers saying we watch for people walking very fast, we will watch for people who are looking at us, who obviously are looking nervous, etc. Did you ever develop a particular technique for when you are around, walking around or on duty in particular, of knowing some telltale signs when you thought something was going on, as opposed to someone running out the shop with someone screaming after him?
Yeah, I think I did. I think I almost arrived as a 17-year-old with, I mean, I grew up in Edmonton. It was a relatively tough area to grow up in. So you kind of develop a bit of a radar in any event for
Right.
what's not a good thing to be close to. And then if you take that into a policing environment, yes, you have your wits about you, and you'll look as you're walking on the street. And I spent time walking as a uniform officer. You get to interact with people in a way that helps you form a view. And yes, so eye contact's really important. And just where people are, and why they're there at that particular hour. All of it comes together in a way that is helpful. He was just walking back, having bought this,
I see.
and there was a big part of it. You just, several things, several red flags, all fall over in line,
In
and
your mind.
so you
And
stop and have a word, and then one thing
leads to
develops
another.
into
And in
another.
terms of looking at narcotics and the spread of them and the way in which law enforcement investigates, is there a huge difference between what you dealt with and saw and what you would face if you were a narcotics officer in 2025? I mean, of course, I appreciate you've got ways of laundering the money, you've got crypto, but would I be right in saying, look, the fundamentals are the same? You've got to get the product, you've got to buy the product, someone's got to make it, you've got to import it, you've then got to distribute it. Is there anything that you can think of nowadays that has changed fundamentally? More hiding places for drugs being imported?
Right off the bat, the size of the market has changed significantly. It is bigger by a factor of probably 100, maybe more.
Right.
It's an enormous market now, um, and and the supply chain changes. Amphetamines, synthetic drugs, were routinely manufactured in the UK
Right.
before in people's garages or old warehouses or whatever. There would be an amphetamine factory and maybe a pilling machine to turn the powder into tablets if you were making ecstasy or whatever. Although ecstasy came along later.
Mm.
Um, Cocaine was a rarity in the 70s. Um, Heroin much more available, cannabis much more available. All of that imported, obviously. I think the heroin we had in the early 70s tended to come from Southeast Europe, um, Turkey, Iran, that kind of environment. And then later in the 1970s, um, Pakistan, Afghanistan came much more into focus as a source for heroin. Cannabis came from a range of sources. There was red leb from Lebanon. There was Moroccan hash. There was Nepalese cannabis that came in really thick resinous rolls. And then you would have um, uh, the vegetative variety of cannabis that came from the Caribbean or from other parts of Africa. Got quite odd supply chains. Most of it now is grown in the UK.
Really? What in these farms that you
In
see on TV?
hydroponics. Yeah,
Hydroponics.
yeah. Um, some is still imported, but the vast quantities are manufactured here now.
And investigative techniques, you were teaching, if I'm right, you were teaching covert, you were teaching the younger officers who were preparing to go into or training to go into covert investigations. Do you think that's changed much over the years in terms of how you would teach if you were transported to Hendon today?
I think the basics of the training program are probably still relatively similar um, to the way we were running it in the late 80s, early 90s. That was when the first training programs emerged. Um, Beyond that, um, everything everything revolves around tradecraft, and tradecraft these days is much more about digital connectivity and you need to understand the market that you're engaging with.
Mm,
So you need to understand prices and quality and routes and methodologies, and everything moves with the times. They're constantly updating the way that they do business in just the same way that the tobacco companies are constantly diversifying the products that they're offering, and the pricing and the delivery programs, and the way they move them, way they invest their assets. um, that the financial world is constantly on point, trying to spot criminal assets entering the
mm.
system. Yet billions of pounds do still get into financial systems without being spotted.
And
And that's
when sorry to
down to
interrupt you, but when you were involved, I imagine that there were quite a few um, scenarios where you were working together with international police forces, Interpol, or other countries' police forces.
many times.
And how did that work? Did you feel that there was an ability, or there was um, a positive element about cooperation? And do you think that that's still the case these days?
There was a very positive um, and receptive market for cross-border investigations where the intelligence was strong. Um, and Interpol sometimes had a part to play. Um, bilateral arrangements were also very good, particularly with the United States. They always had a very strong contingent at their embassy in London, who were always open to um, uh, seeing if an investigation had validity in their environment as well as ours. And I did one cross-border investigation with the DEA in the States in the mid 1980s that finished with me having to go to Miami to give evidence in federal court. Um, and that was a very large heroin seizure in the US.
Just pausing on that point, Neil, when you did that, were you concerned at that stage, or did you give your evidence behind a screen? Were you at all nervous that somebody might take retribution as a result of your putting their buddies away?
I suppose there was always in my head a remote possibility that that would come to pass. But I gave evidence pretty much for the entirety of my undercover career in my true identity.
Right.
It was only in later times that there was the potential. But yeah, for the vast, and when I gave evidence in the US, I gave evidence in my true identity.
Right. And were you ever personally, did you ever receive threats, unfortunately, posted through your letterbox or in some other way that people would try and seek retribution or revenge for bringing them in?
I've had someone call me on the work phone, the undercover phone, and be very explicit about what they're going to do to me.
Okay, that's pretty much the same.
That I've found in a way that I've found I actually found on that occasion more unsettling than I should have given it credence for, because I was absolutely confident that they didn't know where I lived, but they alluded to the fact that they did know where I lived, and they would come and get me and my family. That that particular incident was one that took me a while to clamber over.
And I'm sure that you have to refer that up the tree in terms of if you've got a call like that and somebody does a risk assessment as to whether or not you need protection.
Yeah, I'm not so sure the risk assessment process was quite as well developed back in those days as it is now, Gary. But yes, essentially,
Right.
someone had a discussion with me and drew the same conclusion that I did, that I wasn't really at risk, and if anything else happened, to give them a ring.
To give them a ring, right? And they'll send a panda car around every 4 hours or something.
Not many people will know what a panda car is, Gary.
No, you're right. You're right. I'm showing my age as well. So coming back to, because everyone finds undercover work, I mean, super interesting. I don't think I could ever do it. I'm just far more of a volatile personality, but I've known you for a few years, and I spoke to, in fact, another friend of mine from the used to be at the Met has also been kind enough to join me in a podcast, and he's got a very similar temperament. And you alluded to it before. If you are Mr. Even Keel, if not very much, it's quite difficult. I would think it's quite difficult to upset or rile you, Neil. Would I be right?
Yeah, pretty much. I do get angry, but I don't show it very easily.
So what happens? What does it do? Does it emanate, or does it express itself in terms of, I don't know, cramps internally? When you're really cross, what physical change comes over you, or nobody would ever know that it's happening?
My children would say, "You always know when Dad's angry because he grits his teeth in a way that you have to look to see. But if you can see those teeth being gritted, you know that it's going bad."
Okay, that's fair enough, because you did tell me you've got 2 or 3 kids from your first marriage. I can't remember.
2 from my first marriage, 2 from my second.
And in your second marriage, you also were working at some stage within the police as well, or you had both of them. So
Yeah,
your kids in the first marriage, what did they think of having a dad as a policeman? Was it? I mean, you didn't use words like super cool, but were they like really interested? And they came home every day from school saying, "Dad, who did you nick today?"
they would have done if I'd have ever been there when they got home from school. I I, I, I probably work 12, 14 hours most days.
I see. And that sort of links back to the conversation we had before about the toll that this kind of job, or and indeed any workaholic style of human being, takes on family. You're just not there. And of course, I was in a similar position, came back from Hong Kong. I was 35 and I was building up my career, and I was out at 7 in the morning and back at 9 at night, and didn't see the kids for 3 years when they were after they were born. And I am pretty sure even today they feel as if I let them down at certain stages. So I can relate to that position, Neil. Did you actually at the time understand that that was the decision, and the sort of quid pro quo was that you were going to be an absent father? I know you were, but the long-term impact of that, did you ever think about that or not?
I'm not sure at the time. I thought I was being a particularly absent father. My a breadwinner, all that kind
Yeah,
of sort of traditional thinking was um, was in my DNA, I think.
yeah,
Um, and um, yeah, I was on a mission, I suppose, to a degree. Um, I wasn't completely absent as a
no,
father, and if you ask my two older lads, they they would both say that they don't actually remember much of my absence.
okay.
Um, so they're quite gracious about their upbringing, and we're still good friends.
Well, you've told me that before, and I think that's a tribute to you, my friend, that you've got that relationship. And in terms of being a disciplinarian, I don't know, I'm going to take a wild guess and say that you were the more mild-mannered um, parental force in the family, and it was your wife. I know she was there, had to be there most of the time, but was she the bad guy, and you the good guy, or have I got it wrong?
I think those roles were interchangeable. Um, so yeah, it wasn't not as clear cut as that.
Okay. And there was a time as your career, um, as you got more senior, and I guess you did less undercover work and more training, as you said, of undercover
Yeah,
police officers.
yeah.
Did you miss the buzz? Did you really want to continue doing that UC work, or not really?
It became it became as plain as a pikestaff that I was more useful um, in an oversight role than I was um, by continuing to kind of uh, deploy in an undercover role. I had more to offer, um, shaping um, investigations with colleagues who were in those roles. Some of them of long standing, some of the newer entrants to the business, but it it was quite clear that um, it was the right time to shift gear into a much more um, I'm not going to say management role because that would be underselling it. It became it was almost a consultancy um, role that you would bring this growing portfolio of both personal experience but expertise that you gained by having a view of all of the activity that was going on in that environment, and being able to learn from others' experience and build that into both training and practice.
Right. And I know because we're getting towards the witching hour, which has just flown by, and I'm going to truncate lots of bits of experience, but you leave the police and then you go into the private sector. What was your first job after leaving the police, Neil?
I left the police for a brief period and worked in the traditional private security world, doing risk assessments for businesses, and some consultancy work. And then I went back to the national agency when it was formed in 2006. Spent another 6 years working for them as a deputy director, and then left. And at that stage, my second wife, was very unwell. Had cancer the second time around, and I needed to be more available. So I worked in a family business, which was an English wine business, and in commodities trading, natural rubber. Working with family, it was something that I could do as a part-time thing, and I began working with Stop the Traffic as a volunteer. I could do a lot of that from home or with occasional deployments. I'd worked with them as a volunteer while I was still in service, and had introduced them to the Serious Organised Crime Agency, um, because they knew more about human trafficking than we did as an agency in sort of 2007-8. Human trafficking wasn't the priority crime type in those days that it is now. And so Stop the Traffic's relationship with the national agency is partly responsible for accelerating that conversation.
Right.
And 2010, while I was still serving, I took some time out and went with them to Southwest Asia, to India. We spent some time with a partner, men who'd been in a city in India for decades, some of them, trying to teach them skills that would sustain them and feed them and their children, they having been kicked out of the brothels for not making enough money anymore. And I listened to their stories being played back through an interpreter and was instantly interested in where are these stories. If we can gather these in quantity, we can begin to understand how we need to work to prevent people being trafficked in the first place, because they were able to tell us where they had been when they were first recruited, how that happened, the journeys they'd taken into trafficking.
Because the whole thing of people trafficking, is it just that the label became more familiar or became a thing? Because historically, people have always used mules to move drugs. They've always intimidated. They've always, sadly, kidnapped and forced people to do things that they didn't want to do. So, what changed, do you think, before we leave our conversation? What changed in the awareness of humanity that suddenly everything that's been going on for years suddenly got this label and it became an important thing to get involved in?
I think we had, prior to that, kind of ignored it as and if someone was a drug mule, they'd get arrested for possession of drugs, and they would essentially take the fall for the drug trafficker. If you go to the jungles of Colombia where they're making cocaine in jungle labs, most of the people working in those jungle labs are working there at the point of a gun.
Correct.
They don't have autonomy, and many of the people selling sex don't have the autonomy to make a choice to go and do something different. They're stuck in there until they're either too old to work or they clamber out the window and run away. So it was that earlier recognition in me that this was something that we in law enforcement had missed, and it really wasn't very different from plantations in southern USA in the early 1800s. We just needed to process the information in a way that was helpful. so followed the Modern Slavery Act. And from that 2010 meeting, I was on a mission to try to find ways to gather industrial quantities of lived experience so that everybody who needed to have access to an understanding about how it works and where it works could access that from the people who'd experienced it.
So just very briefly, I know some of this, but not enough to be able to talk to it the way you will. As we are parting company, just tell us now where the hub stands in terms of the richness of data, what kind of data, and who is able to access it, i.e. the role that it is playing, the really critical role that it's playing in helping to stop people trafficking.
The Traffic Analysis Hub is a repository of vast quantities of lived experience narratives drawn from all sources. So open sources, from individual experience, their debriefs with the people who are restoring them, classified and ingested into a system that presents it in a map-based format. So you can log into the system if you're a not-for-profit, if you're law enforcement, if you're a business with a supply chain, if you've got a legitimate reason for having access to it. If you're not a commercial entity, you can have access to it at no cost. If you're a commercial entity, we like to try and get you to pay. It's a very intuitive platform, map-based. So if you want to know what's happening in the county of Sussex in England over the last 6 months, you can apply a series of filters, including dates, and zoom in to Sussex, and there will be a number of icons that you can click on, and it will give you a story.
Okay.
And if you want to download that data, you could do that.
Okay. And with the advent of AI, is that data going to become so much more useful in the investigation and detection of crime? I mean, and I'm assuming every bit of software has got some AI factor in there, but is there a way in which people are, and you are looking now at, you know what, if we take this data and we apply some AI formulae to it, this is going to be just even better gold dust than we had before?
As AI progresses, it's not totally reliable, of course, AI, as we know. But as AI progresses, we are constantly updating the way that the AI generates location data from the material we've got. So it's much more accurate now. The way it winnows out and decides on just how reliable the data that we're collecting is. So there's a reliability score, etc. It's becoming a swift way of understanding how trends in trafficking are changing month on month, year on year. You can display routes into trafficking from Brazil into Ireland if you want to,
right?
And it will show you that whilst 2 years ago that was quite a rarity, now in 2025 it's very much not a rarity. So this helps helps the user to understand what to look for and where to look for it.
Well, Neil, I'm aware that I have kept you, not against your will, I hope, I've kept you in your chair without a good cup of tea for just over an hour. And I wanted to say what a pleasure it was spending a concentrated period of time. I hope I didn't get too intrusive and too personal, but I've now come away richer, I promise you, as a person, as a result of having shared some time with you. So thank you very much. And who knows, I may well be knocking on your virtual door for part 3, etc. of Neil Giles, Investigator Extraordinaire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. You have a lovely evening.
Take care now. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please click and subscribe to the Intelligence Advantage podcast on Spotify and other platforms.